couldn't be more urgent or timely. So Mark is the author of Analytical Fascism, What Stares Back When One Stares into the De-Enlightenment, which will be the book he's discussing with us today. This book is just the latest in what I take to be a very impressive body of work, which spans questions of liberty, justice, unemployment, and economic structures. Mark's previous books have been published by Cambridge University Press, Oxford University Press, and Palgrave Macmillan, and his work has been translated into French, German, Italian, Japanese, and other languages, so clearly has a global reach. Mark has taught political, legal, and moral philosophy at institutions across Europe and the US, including University of Manchester, University of Durham, the Frankfurt School of Finance and Management, and the University of California at Davis, and was a faculty fellow at Harvard's Safra Center for Ethics. So among many attributes, what I think makes Mark's book particularly compelling is that it is intervening in a debate which our research team certainly believes is very central to the political moment that we're living through. How do people come to embrace authoritarian or anti-liberal ideologies, and what normative visions of the future are embedded in turn? So in taking fascism seriously, not just as a political threat, but as a moral worldview, Mark is challenging us to rethink how we defend liberalism. So I'm sure this will be a very exciting talk. Please join me in welcoming Mark for a 45-minute talk, which will be followed by a 45-minute Q&A. Thank you, Mark.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for inviting me. I'm really glad to be here. Although I think it's fair to say that my lecture today will be kind of depressing. I wish I had some sort of tip or secret insight to give everybody that would make everything all better, and that would be simple to go out and do, but I have no such insight. I think really my vision of the future is that the future is very dark indeed. I've been thinking about that song. I don't know, maybe you're all too young to remember that, but something about the future's so bright I have to wear shades. And I was thinking about what the analog of that would be, and maybe it's that the future is so dark we have to wear night vision goggles to see what's going on now. And so I'll talk about my project first. I'm not going to use any PowerPoint or any other kind of video display, so you just have to look at me. I'll try to move around a little bit to keep things visually interesting. I can see my screen kind of flashing on and off. I don't know why that's happening, but perhaps that'll keep things visually interesting. Okay, so what am I doing, and how does it differ from what other people are doing? Of course, there's a lot of books out, some very, very good books about the rise of fascism across the world, and these books all are some of them very detailed. Some are historical. They go through fascist movements throughout history. They give very detailed descriptions of how they came to be, the kinds of techniques they used, the common themes in an approach they have, things like that. Those books are all, very important, and we ought to read them. But I don't want to, this is not a put down, but it's a description so we can understand them. They're all about means and methods. They're about how fascist movements arise, what techniques and tactics they use to take power, what things eventually lead them to disintegrate and fall apart. And it's very instructive to read those, but what they're not about is the fundamental values that attract people towards fascism. And I think people tend to think fascism is amoral or perhaps immoral, and that liberalism is the antidote, is the moral political theory, and that so what we're engaged in is an argument sort of for morality and against immorality. But I think that's wrong. I mean, I think that fascism has a very developed, consistent, coherent moral system. its moral system is perverse from the liberal point of view, but it nevertheless is a moral system. And even though it is perverse from the liberal point of view, what we have to understand is that the moral system, the moral framework that provides the structure for thinking about fascism as a moral system and the moral system that provides a structure for thinking about liberalism as a moral system are so different. It's very difficult for adherents of one side or the other side to share the same language and to be able to talk to each other. And that's why I think we find ourselves mostly talking past each other. Because the one thing that is not a good technique for defending liberalism is to attack people who are fascist for being illiberal. I mean, if you accuse someone for being a racist and they are a racist, that's not a critique. That's a compliment, right? They're going to say, yeah, you got it. That's the idea. We're racist. And I think the problem now is liberals seem to think the attraction of liberalism is so self-evident that all they need to do is point out the ways in which various fascist groups or fascist-leaning groups are tending towards being illiberal. And if we simply illustrate that, that will convince people how unattractive those ideas are. And I think that just is a misunderstanding of what's going on. And that's not engaging with the arguments, with the issues that are really at work here. So I think exhausting as this is, we have to continuously explain why the fundamental values of liberalism are more attractive than the fundamental values of fascism. And we can't just assume that the perversity of fascist values is obvious, because obviously they're not obvious, because a lot of people seem to be attracted to that. Now, a couple of sort of definitional things I want to talk about first. First, what I'm talking about here is fundamental values. And by fundamental values, I mean values that are presupposed, values that provide a framework within which moral discussion can take place. Because without such a framework, you can't talk to each other, because one doesn't know what's good or bad. So one has to have some shared general moral system within which to have a moral debate. Now, these values can be very, very general, and they often are. They're concepts, not conceptions. And because they're concepts, they're very vague, and they need to be further refined before we know exactly what they mean and how to apply them to our everyday life. And what that means is that people can have a shared value system, but disagree continuously about what that shared value system requires that we do. So, for example, one could have a disagreement about affirmative action within liberalism. Some liberals might say, well, this is necessary to repair some of the damage done from hundreds of years of discrimination against certain groups. Other liberals might say, yes, but the whole point of liberalism is that we should consider these factors in making decisions, and that even when we say what we're doing is we're only doing this as a matter of as a remedy and not as a policy, that's still a violation of liberalism's values, and we shouldn't then be endorsing things like affirmative action. Now, that's a disagreement within liberalism, because people are arguing about what liberalism requires us to do. But we could also have an argument about affirmative action where some people say, well, affirmative action is wrong because it helps black people. Black people are inferior people. They're not allowed to have the same privileges as white people, and they shouldn't be treated better than white people, and they shouldn't even be treated as equal as white people. And that's a very different argument. It's a disagreement not on an interpretive level, but on a fundamental level. And that's what I'm trying to suggest here. And when you're arguing with someone, you really have to know whether your disagreement is interpretive. In other words, it's a disagreement over the same set of fundamental values, or it's fundamental, whether the person you're disagreeing with has a different set of fundamental values, because if that's what's going on, you're going to need to say some very different things if you're going to try and actually engage with those people. Okay, so that's what I mean by fundamental. A couple other things I want to talk about. I guess I should say a little bit about the terms liberalism and fascism. By liberalism, I don't mean people on the moderate left. I'm talking about liberalism in its very, very general, broad, children of the Enlightenment sense, in which it's intended to include people on the moderate left, people in the center, people on the moderate right as well. It would include most of the, for a time, most of the major political parties in Europe. That's not true anymore. But Christian Democrats would be liberals in the sense. There was a time when both Democrats and Republicans in the U.S. were liberals in that sense. So it's intended to be very broad and all-encompassing. And by fascism, I'm trying to use an equally broad and encompassing term for right-wing illiberalism. And I've called illiberalism in general perfectionism in some of my other works. I'm not going to use that term here today, and I'm not going to talk about left-wing illiberalism, even though I think everything I have to say really does apply to left-wing illiberalism. But since the problem facing us here in the States and in most of Europe and really all over the world is really right-wing illiberalism now, I'm going to limit myself to that. And I think the best way to describe what's going on, or this group of political theories, is to call it fascism, because we need a word that, at least to liberals, carries the emotional power that I think this frightening turn in politics requires. I think it's cowardly to just try and give it a lot of other terms and argue about whether the term fascism is correct. So I'm going to use fascism in that sense. Okay, so let's begin. And this is going to be a little bit inside baseball, but I think given the group here we have, it's all political theorists. I hope everybody can appreciate this. It's a sort of technical political theory argument. Let's begin with what constitutes the fundamental presupposition of morality, and the question that begins that inquiry is, what is the moral subject? And so we all know the work of John Rawls, and Rawls considers the moral subject the person, and he thinks under this conception of the moral subject, people are said to possess two moral powers. The first is to have a capacity for a sense of justice that guides them when engaging in social cooperation. The second is a capacity to form and pursue a conception of the personal good, an idea of what ends one as an individual should pursue. This is what Rawls thinks, and I think it's fair to say that this is really what all liberal political philosophers think as well. I don't think there's really any serious disagreement with him over this concept. But you can see, I think, if this is where you start, if this is what the moral subject is, this means that political theory under liberalism is going to be about facilitating fair terms of social cooperation between individuals and ensuring that every individual is able to pursue any reasonable conception of their own personal good, free from interference by others. And so given that fundamental conception of the moral subject, that's going to determine what morality or political morality is going to be about. But unlike liberalism, fascism doesn't begin with the conception of the person. It begins with what we might call a conception of the people. One way of looking at this is under fascism, the individual is not an autonomous moral end by itself, but rather a component of a larger organic fundamental moral unit. Individuals are like cells in a living organism. Their importance is only whether they perform their assigned function. The individuals are part of the larger body of the people. And some people are skin cells, some people are brain cells, some people are eye cells. And their role, they have a role in this function, but it's that larger organism, and it's only that larger organism that can form moral ends and that can be morally responsible for things. So only this larger organic unit is fundamental, and only it and other similarly composed but competing larger fundamental units can harbor and pursue moral ends. Okay, so these are two very different conceptions of where we start. And we can see right away that if we start in those different places, we immediately go to some very different directions. Because it doesn't start with a conception of the person, the natural building blocks for a fascist framework of political morality are categories of people. And the idea is that everyone exists within a finely grained social hierarchy. For example, every man is of higher status than any women. Indeed, all men have intrinsic value, whereas women only have instrumental value. But of course, some kinds of men are of higher status than other kinds, and some men within each kind are of higher status than others of that kind. And so in a fascist society, working out this social hierarchy and seeing where one falls is critical to deciding what morality requires us to do. This social hierarchy is deemed to have been set by God. In the eyes of some, or in the eyes of others, it's the product of the natural distribution of talents and abilities, although one can see a lot of biases and prejudices built into that explanation right from the get-go. And I suppose the observation that hierarchical relations are built into many aspects of not just historical, but modern life. It's not only a central feature of most religious beliefs, this hierarchical organization. It's a natural and perhaps even necessary feature of the family unit. It's true in the military, of course, in the workplace, and so on and so forth. We can find lots of examples of the use of hierarchical structure as an organizing feature. So given this, I think it's easy to see why some people feel that hierarchical relations should define all aspects of our lives and not just these very common applications of our lives. And of course, liberals don't deny that there may be some natural appeal of hierarchical relations. And it's the same thing that I think liberals don't deny that there might be some sort of embedded or hardwired tendency among people to be racist or to be sexist or to have find other kinds of hierarchical relations attractive. But liberals believe that we're creatures with minds. We can therefore overcome our primal instincts and traditional practices when these are unjust and not simply pander to them whenever and wherever they arise. On the other hand, fascists believe that it's both pointless and senseless to fight against the natural order of things. They view their role as instantiating that natural order, and therefore they see status as the central organizing feature of social and political life. And of course, exceptions are possible. Some women, for example, have a greater share of natural talents and abilities than some men. Fascists aren't blind to this. Indeed, some women have become leaders of fascist parties, especially in Europe, or otherwise become powerful figures in fascist or quasi-fascist movements. But this does not change these women's place in the social hierarchy or otherwise challenge the underlying assumptions regarding how natural talents and abilities are generally distributed. To the fascists, these are conceptual categories, not empirical ones. And as conceptual categories, the distinctions between intrinsic and inherent value and relative social status are not subject to rebuttal by counterexample. And then, of course, there are many other conceptual categories in which people can be sorted besides men and women. These categories can also be conveniently identified by what would be other supposedly biological, racial, ethnic, religious, objective or quasi-objective markers. And this is where racism, anti-Semitism, homophobic, ethnic and religious nationalism, and so on come in to complement the sexism of the social hierarchy. And although the details may vary from fascist society to fascist society, what is fundamental here is the belief that there is a rigid, pre-existing social hierarchy that must be respected for society to exist. The details simply depend on which particular fascist movement one has in mind. Okay, so that's how we tell the difference between groups, but rankings are also necessary within groups as well as between groups. For status is the essential guideline through which all social interaction must occur. Everyone must be ranked, and not just ranked between by those who are group members and those who are outsiders. And this is done by, again, the outward presentation of objective indicators of value, such as wealth, beauty, strength, and business, political, and social success. This is how people are ranked within the group. Just as kind of a footnote, one common attribute that's not usually considered valuable within the fascist worldview, although it can perhaps controversially be considered at least quasi-objective, is intelligence. Intelligence for the fascists is more like salt. It has value, but only up to a point. One needs a little of it, but in amounts that are too generous, it loses value and becomes a carrier of increasing disvalue. Okay, so what this means, of course, is that fascists fundamentally disagree with the liberal idea that all people have equal moral worth. Indeed, given human experience, fascists contend that it's obvious that people are not equal. People actually exist on a multivariated scale in the sense that in any pairwise comparison, one person is always better in the relevant hierarchical sense of more worthy of moral concern and respect than the other. It's important to recognize, however, that this fundamental principle is not simply a rejection of the idea that all humans have equal moral worth. I think this is another mistake that liberals commonly make. They think this is a rejection of the idea of equality, but that's not all it's there for. It's more importantly a positive argument for how social interaction should be organized. That's how thoroughly this idea runs through fascist thinking. It's in a fascist society, and an essential element of every social interaction is the determination of where each participant falls in the social hierarchy, for this indicates the rules by which the interaction can take place. And it's also important to note that the possession of the correct objective or quasi-objective signatures of high social status is a necessary but not sufficient indicator of one's place in the social hierarchy. One must also possess the correct spiritual or cultural characteristics, as indicated by one's expressed attitudes and views. And it doesn't really matter what your attitudes really are. What matters is what attitudes you express, because remember, we're really focusing on the objective or quasi-objective here. And this is, for example, how Trump can be a favorite of Christian evangelicals, despite the fact that he's as bad as unchristian a person as one could imagine. Now, some of you might realize there's long been a debate in fascist circles between those who embrace what's sometimes called nationalistic or biological racism and those who embrace cultural or spiritual racism. But in my view, this debate has little practical significance. It could be thought, and some people do actually argue this, that those who argue for spiritual or cultural racism are more sophisticated than those who argue for nationalistic or biological racism. For if we're going with the spiritual view, this would allow for such a thing as a Jewish Nazi or an Aryan Jew, which does seem at least possible. But in practice, this is not true, I think, because spiritual and cultural characteristics are only used to exclude those who bear the correct objective markers, not to include those who do not share these markers, but have some spiritual affinity with those who do. And this is why would-be immigrants who are religious conservatives, either brown-skinned Spanish-speaking Catholics or any kind of Muslims, are not welcomed by self-proclaimed white Christian societies, despite their affinity for many of the same conservative values. These spiritual or cultural characteristics, in other words, only can rule people out. They can't rule people in who might otherwise be excluded because of their objective characteristics like their skin color or ethnicity. Again, there are exceptions. An individual with the correct ideological affinities, but with contraindicated objective features might be included in the main group for some time as a useful idiot or as an object of entertainment. And there will always be some people who find this attractive. They like the idea of being objectively disqualified, but yet somehow included, and so they're happy to be used by the ruling class in this way. But again, it doesn't change the idea that this may be only expedient or a temporary permission to join the group. It's not permanent. That this narrow exclusivity of the applicable conception of the people is what's the basis of what's called the Great Replacement theory. The idea that outsiders are being imported in the country to overwhelm the voting power of white people, and an idea that's constantly being promoted in the U.S. by contemporary figures like Tucker Carlson, and it's my understanding it's also being often argued by people in Europe as well. Because Carson and people who think like him contend that only true Americans are entitled to a voice in their government, regardless of their legal status. Those who deviate in either objective or ideological ways are not members of the community, no matter what liberals might try to claim, but rather beings of lesser moral worth, and must accordingly be excluded when it comes to deciding how the people should rule themselves. Now, tied to this is a very strong reverence for blood and soil. Fascists believe that all people are naturally or perhaps supernaturally connected to both the land of their ancestors and the bloodline out of which they arise, and not in the trivial liberal sense in which people sport some associational ties to their history and their ancestors and their community. The importance for fascists of this connection is much greater than this. And this is because under the typical fascist theory of history, the first period of any historical cycle is when greatness truly reigned. They believe there's some sort of superior genetic material in the blood of the ruling class, which have been passed down to what should be the ruling class of the future. Maybe this is because of surviving pagan notions that the land gives birth to those meant to live upon it. In any case, the maintenance of the bloodline of the relevant community and the continuous territorial possession of land historically associated with the community is viewed as an essential part of what gives requisite hierarchy its stability. Of course, the connection between people and their land is often imagined, or at least much more tenuous than assumed. Most people today live on land that is originally someone else's property, and bloodlines have become inextricably intermixed. But again, it's important to understand that this claimed connection is not an empirical claim, it's a conceptual claim. It's more of a nationalistic myth than a recitation of historic fact. And the actual historic facts don't matter. The founding myth is an act of affirmation for those particular people. The land is a gift from God to a specific people, or for the secular fascist, it's theirs by right because of their sheer number and importance of their years of possession of it. It's not a historical claim of clean legal title. Even those who have been removed from the soil for a very long time, perhaps generations or even millennia, can still claim a natural or supernatural connection to their mythic homeland. For such a deep connection cannot be broken, and even if faded, can always be rekindled. Now, given the importance, assigned to blend soil and to various objective, quasi-objective, natural, and ideological pre-commitments, it should be no surprise that purity has intrinsic value for the fascist. One cannot value historical bloodlines and racial and ethnic categories without valuing purity. And purity is to be understood as contrary to pluralism, the miscegenation of people and the dissolution of their purity through the increasing compromise of their values, qualities, and social vision. Indeed, to the fascists, it's liberalism's commitment to pluralism that makes social life a constant war of all against all, as Hobbes predicted. Purity, and not just authority, is therefore an essential feature of social peace. And this is why, for example, that Trump, as Hitler did before him, rails against those who, because of their place of birth or their religion or ethnicity or of them or their parents or grandparents, can be accused of poisoning the blood of our country. But purity is valuable for its own sake, not just because it's seen as having good consequences. Purity is a form of perfection. And perfection represents an attainment of the ideal. A fascist society is a perfectionist society, as opposed to a society that is simply good enough, which is what liberalism supposedly strives for. Authority is the tool by which fascists attempt to achieve order, but purity is the fundamental value that is being pursued. The cleansing of the social body is as necessary as the cleansing of the biological body if the fascist self-conception of the people is to be maintained. And this, I think, goes some way to explaining the attractiveness of violence. For in an intermixed modern world, purity can only be achieved through some form of violence. I think that's important to keep in mind. This obsession with purity is also why the presence of non-conforming gender and sexual orientation is particularly troubling to fascists. For unlike other exclusionary factors, these non-conforming characteristics cannot be eliminated, only suppressed. They cannot be eliminated by violence. They therefore pose a greater danger than posed by other impurities. Even if you were to kill all the gay people currently living in the world, there would be more gay people in 10 or 20 years because a certain percentage of people born would be gay. And I think this threatens to dilute the purity of a fascist community in two ways. First, it means that non-conforming people are continuously being created within the relevant society itself. Second, it also threatens purity by calling into question the conformity of the parents and institutions that help raise and educate what turn out to be non-conforming adults. In other words, this is not just a concern that there are defective genes being passed down, although that is part of the concern. And that's part of what makes parents nervous, right? Because if you're a parent of a gay child in a fascist society, it's not just the child who's in trouble, it's you as well. But in the sense, fascists are kind of neutral on the nature versus nurture debate. They think it's also how people turn out is also the result of how they're raised and the institutions that raise them. And this is, I think, why fascists are so concerned about rooting out anything that could considered grooming in our public libraries or educational institutions or cultural institutions that are helping transform people who are otherwise conforming into being non-conforming gay or transgender adults. So I think that the transphobia, homophobia is fundamentally not merely a attack on another group. It's viewed by fascists as a form of self-preservation. They feel that the presence of these groups call themselves into question, and it makes everybody nervous that they may be found to be non-conforming, and that's why they're so obsessed with suppressing these kinds of people. Okay, but again, fascists believe not just in biological purity and cultural purity, but in political purity too. This is a necessary corollary of conceiving of the people, not just by their objective identifiers, but also by their cultural, spiritual, and ideological uniformity. And while the achievement of objective purity is not really feasible, even fascists recognize this, in the sense of having people of only one objective kind living in a particular place, ideological purity is conceivably achievable. It's achievable through the imposition of a proper social hierarchy. The impure are assigned lesser value, their numbers are limited, their crimes are punished more severely, even if these may be imagined. In short, they're controlled like pests. And the marginalized who are willing to trumpet the ideology of the ruling class, even if that ideology involves their own suppression, are celebrated, at least for a time, just like voluntary slaves, until their atypical allegiances are no longer instrumentally useful and they're cast out. Okay, so I'm running towards the end here. Let me go where this leads. Okay, so we got categorization of the people. This tells us a lot about what the fascist conception of the political is. The fascist conception of the political is that there's a unity between the state, the leader of the people. And they take this very seriously. This is as much the part of the bedrock of fascism as the belief that the Holy Trinity are not separate and independent figures, but rather different expressions of the same single deity as part of the bedrock of Christianity. So that is very much a fundamental conception. Fascists simply reject the idea that society is thought of as a collection of individuals whose wills can conflict and compete, and therefore must be harmonized. It's the same entity, one entity. Indeed, for the fascists, being an individual makes no sense. All members of the people are defined by their possession of a certain set of characteristics and their adherence to a specific set of views. All members of the fascist community are therefore identical in all relevant respects. Anyone who distinguishes themselves from the community are putting themselves outside the community and are thereby, by definition, making themselves enemies of the community, regardless of whether the degree of distinction is severe or slight. Now, because of this belief in uniformity, I think liberals see fascist societies as inherently anti-democratic, anti-democratic. And of course, there are a lot of fascists who are anti-democratic expressly, but I think this is a mistake resulting from a misunderstanding of both democracy and fascism. Indeed, one of the most esteemed fascist philosophers, Giovanni Gentili, actually claimed that fascism was the greatest expression of democracy ever invented. Mussolini himself, on the stage with Hitler in Berlin in 1937, declared Italy and Germany the greatest and most genuine democracies. And of course, liberals see these claims as ludicrous, but in a sense, they're true. Democracy is a method for deciding how a people should govern themselves and organize their society. And fascism is indeed designed to give effect to the will of the people. For remember, there's nothing in democracy that tells us who the people are. And given the fascist conception of the people and of the political, the leader and the people are one. Following the leader's wishes is thus by definition following the will of the people. Indeed, it's the mediating forces that representative democracy put in the way of the relationship between the leader and the people that are anti-democratic. And for those who want to see one of the most articulate expressions of this view, have a look at Colonel Gaddafi's Little Green Book. You know, Mao had a little red book, Gaddafi had a little green book, which is a collection of his political thoughts. And he has a discussion of this that I think is very articulate and useful. Okay, so how is the leader to be selected? Well, not by elections, surely. These are spectacles meant to trumpet the leader's embodiment of the will of the people to the world. The leader is conceived of an extraordinary figure, larger than life. Such leaders cannot be selected. Instead, their identity becomes manifest through a more natural process, like that associated with the recognition of a religious miracle or prophet. The charisma of the candidate, the intensity of the feeling expressed by his supporters, the size of his rallies, the loyalty he commands, his consistent ability to demonstrate that he's not bound by the norms that govern ordinary men, his decisiveness, these are all hallmarks of he who embodies the will of the people. Okay, I'll skip a little bit forward here. Okay, so we have some idea now of how this can, starting out with the fundamental concept of the moral subject has all these kind of effects. Let's go to what does this fascist political trinity want to do? What does it want to accomplish? And I think here we need to see that it's something not as mundane as mere self-preservation, nor is it to provide the conditions in which every individual is free to pursue their own idiosyncratic but reasonable conception of the good, as it is in liberalism. On a day-to-day level, the function of the political trinity is to put the plans of the leader into motion, but the overall purpose of the trinity is to create greatness, be it great architecture, great nations, great wealth, great power, or whatever. And greatness is demonstrated by moving mountains, not by building tiny homes. As Nietzsche is commonly thought to have claimed, the purpose of social cooperation is not to maximize the overall productivity or well-being of society, but to throw up a few great men. The monuments, both metaphorical and literal, that these great men leave behind is the true measure of a society's success. So size, then, is incredibly important, and not just in the Freudian sense. Impact is a measure of greatness, the antidote to existential angst, the fear that one does not exist or may not be remembered. And impact is value neutral. Impact, accordingly, need not be good or bad in the liberal sense. What is important in the fascist sense is that it's big. If attempts at creation are frustrated or merely seen as just too difficult, then the appropriate response is not to retreat and surrender to passivity, but to cause significant and even widespread social and physical destruction. And this, I think, explains what Trump is doing all too well. People say, doesn't he understand that this is not going to work, or that this is not going to create the kind of society he wants, or the kind of order he wants? And the answer is it doesn't matter. It's going to have a big impact. And having a big impact is what the fascist wants to do. Okay, so I could go on and talk about the relation of domination and subservience, and of masculinity and femininity, but maybe I'll do that in the question and answer period. And otherwise stop there.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was fascinating and exactly on time. So I appreciate both of those things. So for the Q&A, we operate